In one of the greatest stories of our time, One Piece, there used to be a place called Lulusia Kingdom. This time the One Piece spoilers a little more recent, chapter 1060 of the manga and episode 1089 of the anime. I don't consider it a huge spoiler, but evidently my philosophy on spoilers is broken compared to most of the internet, so just skip to the next chapter if you're sensitive to that sort of thing. Also, what are you doing here? Go read One Piece. Seriously, stop. Read One Piece. I'm not huge on the anime, but that's still One Piece of a variety, so watch that if you can't read. I'll be here when you're done. The Lulusia Kingdom underwent a revolution in which the king and his daughter were dethroned and imprisoned. In doing so, they removed themselves from the grasp of the world government, the ruling body of the planet. Said government responded to this coup by wiping it off the face of the earth and scrubbing it from historical texts. Just like that, a snap of their fingers, and the island never existed. After all, if the citizens of this kingdom were not part of the world government, they may as well be pirates. The Pokémon Company is a Goliath. It owns almost everything that relates to the IP: art, merchandise, shows, manga, music, and of course, the video games. They're some of the most militant forces when it comes to shutting down unofficial projects in their continued quest for dominance. When a work defies it too loudly, it clamps down hard. One such project, set to be released in 2016, was a Generation 2 game. Headed up by Cool Boy Man and assisted by Twitch Plays Pokémon, the trailer immediately preceding its launch date garnered 1.4 million views. It had been in development for nearly a decade, and major games press outlets like Kotaku were writing about it, singing its praises. That game would have been known as Pokémon Prism, and it would have been released in 2016 until a cease and desist from Nintendo shut it down. I want to talk about the legacy of this unreleased game and its main developer, Cool Boy Man, who's one of the pioneers of the Pokémon fan developer space. While it might not be my favorite fan game, or even really the peak of what this space has to offer, it is likely one of the best Pokémon games that never released. And even if I cannot legally recommend it to anyone, I can make a video talking about how kick-ass it might have been if it were to ever be released. This is Pokémon Prism, the best Pokémon game that doesn't technically exist. Cool Boy Man got his start in this space with Pokémon Brown version, originally released in 2004. It was one of the first notable Pokémon hacks based on the first generation games. Prism was going to be the Pokémon Gold and Silver to this release, a generational sequel with a region built right next to Brown. So to help give some context, I figured it wouldn't hurt to spend a little time talking about the 20th anniversary re-release. Pokémon Brown version introduces the Région region. It's located directly south of the Johto region and shares a lot in common with the Kanto region. The layout's original, with many of the same kinds of roadblocks: trees to cut, bodies of water to surf on, and boulders to push. If you squint, you can kind of match up the general map with the Kanto layout. It has a lot of the same vague hallmarks, but messes with those expectations in a way that's unsettling. There's a town on the water to the east of the region called Castro Valley, with striking similarities to Vermilion City. The SS Anne is docked to the south, with a gym to fight that has a layout which brings to mind Koga, except against fighting-type trainers. Next door is Castro's mansion, with the same gimmick and rough layout as Cinnabar Island's mansion. Here you find the virus scan, which you use north of the valley in Botan City. This city has a haunted forest infested by strange ghosts called Missing No, a reference almost anyone who's aware of the first gen would recognize. You also battle your rival and a bunch of mystics, thwarting Team Rocket at the end who've kidnapped someone important to the city. If you've played Red and Blue before, events like this constantly tug at the fringes of your brain, inviting a strong sense of familiarity before yanking it away. It's been a while since I played a Pokemon game which stressed my navigation. I took my knowledge of these games for granted, that I knew where all of the key items were and what the best order to do everything was. I've played most generations a little too much, I think. It was intimidating being dropped into the Region region with so many recognizable motifs, only to find myself brushing up against roadblock after roadblock, lost in a decidedly unrecognizable environment. It is not afraid to let you wander into places you shouldn't be exploring yet. There's a similar moment here midway through the adventure where you crack the world wide open and are free to challenge several gyms in any order, exactly like Red and Blue. That sense of freedom goes far beyond Kanto and is much less balanced. As soon as you gain access to Cut, you can open up the gym in your starting town. It's full of trainers in the 40s though, and you need Surf to even challenge the leader, meaning you shouldn't really be there as soon as you're able to access it. Just north of this town, once you obtain Surf, there's a cave accessed with Cut and a trainer who level checks you at the entrance with Mons in the 70s. No warning, just death. I still don't really know what the point of that is when your reward is a level 50 Entei. Despite the modern version of Brown featuring additions from future generations, it stubbornly hangs on to little quirks like the 1% Gen 1 miss or speed being tied to critical hit rate, which can make certain battles a lot more frustrating than they otherwise would be. Still, if this is what you love about Red and Blue, as I've seen so many people profess, this is a game which seeks to maintain those elements rather than sand them off. It's not a pure Gen 1 experience, thanks to the physical special split, a few Pokemon and evolutions from future generations, and a variety of original types like Sound, Wind, and Abnormal. But hey, those types took me off guard in a way I loved, as they felt like types which could have been left on the cutting room floor during Pokemon's initial development. In that way, the changes to the Gen 1 design feel deliberate, a way to redo that generation in an all-new setting, with a wink and a nod to the players. Having Missing No as a part of the region's mythos is dope in a way that really only works because it's fully committed to the bit. Sometimes these meta elements are used for throwaway meme lines on random trainers. This game certainly released originally in 2004. You can feel that. But for the most part, there's an intention here to the thinly veiled fourth wall. It leans into the idea that it doesn't actually exist. It's a fork in the road after Gen 2, geographically splitting off from it, letting you visit and fight Bugsy. Though the Hoenn region is still based off a region of Japan in our world, in the Pokemon world it exists off on its own. But what if there was a third generation which connected to the Johto region, just as Johto sprang forth off the back of the Kanto region? What if each subsequent Pokemon game kept building out this landmass, adding more and more chunks to it? What if we got new types that weren't just Dark Steel or Fairy? Those kinds of questions are inevitable, given the nature of the game not actually existing officially. Why not suggest, then, that this whole escapade's a glitch in the progression of time? We fight Giovanni again, who's here, for some reason, doing almost the same thing he did in Red and Blue. He's even the surprise 8th gym leader. Again. Why? I don't really know. I suppose it's an attempt to explain where he went after Red and Blue, that he was simply biding his time to build up his organization again. It just makes it even weirder that he cut off all contact with his grunts in Johto, but ah well, he's here, I guess. One of the first towns you visit has a department store and also a legally distinct version of the Nugget Bridge to the north. There's a power plant in the middle of the region, but it houses Raikou instead of Zapdos. You also visit a Silphco building where Team Rocket is waiting again. It is clearly doing its own thing, but isn't ever able to fully escape the shadow of the first generation. It's fun, novel, but not very much else. When looking at it today compared to so many other fan games and even some of the official releases, it's not really anything special. That is, until you remember that it was originally released in 2004. That's pretty impressive for the early 2000s when there weren't a lot of options available. Cool Boy Man essentially released his own third version around the same time Pokémon was gearing up for their fourth. For a solo dev working with a codebase they likely didn't even fully understand, it's easy to see how this would eventually lead to its sequel garnering so much acclaim. Pokémon Prism, as it was to be called, is a Generation 2 game, and just as Johto splits off to the west of Kanto, the Naljo region splits off to the west of Rajon. Rather than begin at your house, the title opens with you and your mom sitting by a campfire in the woods, before separating you from her and rather forcibly launching you into a typical Pokémon adventure. Those familiar hints of the base this game is built on top of rear their head. They're a tad more subtle. Professor Ilk still has you head north of the starting town to help someone out, and your rival still steals a Pokémon, except now you're in the snow, and the order of those events have been shuffled around. Your rival steals a Bagon, and you have no choice but to take the professor's Larvitar. These beginning events rob you of any sense of choice that's usually present in Pokémon. Your starter decision is an incredibly iconic facet of every generation. Yellow version is the only one that has ever taken that away, an apt comparison as, like that version, you're given the opportunity to find all three starters throughout your adventure, so that lack of choice isn't inherently a bad thing. That casts a shadow over the region as a whole, which feels like a dark mirror of Johto. That region was already an environmental foil to Kanto, with a focus on natural beauty. The introduction of cities like Goldenrod and a train station were at odds with the quiet, harmonious feel of the rest of the region. Interestingly, Naljo explores similar themes, but chooses to touch on many of the negative consequences of those developments. It's a pretty wild series of events for a Pokemon game. Keep in mind, you still play as a 10-year-old. The Naljo region has you foil the plot of a group of scientists attempting to introduce Pokemon eugenics, are forced to go undercover as a member of the evil team to help the police. In other words, you're temporarily drafted into the FBI, you are arrested for making use of a fake ID, you enter a Gengar-induced acid trip to help one of the gym leaders escape his nightmares, which includes some questionable ideas about immigration and other similar topics. Yeah, so Prism wants to explore some complicated ideas. The 4 new Mons, the Naljo Guardians, came into being to protect the region from invaders, which tumbles headfirst into a discussion about immigration, imperialism, and a ton of other messy topics that I do not think it was prepared to handle. And why would it? It's still a Pokemon game where your main goal is to challenge the League. Even games like Black and White, which veered pretty damn close to the political sun in the ideas it was expressing, never felt this pessimistic. The Pokemon world is one full of hopes and dreams, or even unbelievably wild subject matter spun into something wholesome and agreeable at the end. Prism is an edgy game, dare I say, and it casts a pretty wide net. It wants to talk about the effects of rapid advancement of technology, a large influx of immigrants with other cultures and values flooding into a once isolated region, a stubborn Charizard father wishing that his Charmander son would grow up to be strong like him and learn how to swim just as his parents taught him, and as mentioned before, Pokémon eugenics. It's actually entertaining in its own way how it shotgun blasts these ideas with very little subtlety, and then kind of just moves on from it to the next wacky happening. The evil team usually has some relation to the main theme of the region they're terrorizing, but here it's just a bunch of Power Rangers being paid by eugenicists. That doesn't make them bad, though. I actually find them to be one of the most interesting evil teams mechanically, since the palette patrollers are far fewer in number. Instead of fighting a bunch of weak, faceless grunts, you consistently fight their smaller roster who each have rival-worthy teams to square up against. They each represent a color, as well as the appropriate evolution, and that's a delicious degree of charm. Inspired me to pick up an EV of my own and evolve it into a Glaceon. The trend of faceless grunts barraging you with battles you never think twice about is one I'm okay with abandoning. especially since it's replaced here with a bigger focus on puzzle solving through large dungeons. There are fun little touches, like needing an electric-type Pokemon to light up caves, or needing a fire-type to light something. It's a more fun way to use your Pokemon for progression that doesn't needlessly restrict your team like HMs do. Those are here, though. It is still a Pokemon game. Naljo has the most mechanical variety of any region I've explored. These dungeons are huge, with 2D segments that remind me of Link's Awakening. You even get an upgrade that lets you jump over one-tile-wide gaps, which is a neat little feature that also applies to the overworld. These go a layer deeper when you have to send one of your Pokemon into a mini-dungeon of their own, where they battle and solve point-and-click type navigation puzzles. The region generally is very classic formula friendly, allowing you to backtrack when you unlock HMs and other progression keys. If you pine for the days where Pokemon was more about exploring the region, like I do, Prism captures that feeling so well. If I were to be so bold, there are elements of this adventure I straight up preferred to the generation it's built on top of. Everyone goes crazy for remakes which bring the old into the new, but I'm a lot more interested in demakes. I find it more fun to see how something new translates into something old, and the demade sprites are slick as hell. Spores escape from the top of Shroomer's head, Luxray's body flashes with yellow lightning, you can see Ralts' eyes peek out from under its hair. It's so wonderful to see these newer Mons reimagined in the Gen 2 sprite style. It's always been a shame that Mons like Meganium lost a lot of their spunk in the transition to future gens, and I think it owes a lot of that flavor to the limited staging and pixels available to the Game Boy. Not one of these new Pokemon are out of place, and I think a few of them even fit better in this graphical style. Lines like Garchomp are even more fluidly animated than they were in their debut games, and their colors pop a lot more. What's even more impressive though is that the additions unique to Prism are seamless. Why not have a move like Toxic Spikes, but for burn? Just place a lava pool under the opponent's side of the field. Genius idea. Or how about a poison move called Steel Eater, which bypasses Steel's immunity to poison? Considering Freeze Dry would later become a thing, I could totally see a move like this becoming real one day in some form. Prism actually has Freeze Burn, which can cause both freeze and burn, very similar to Tri-Attack. Many of these new moves are focused on adding more chances for cool synergies, like Stormfront having a chance to set the rain, or Spring Bud having a chance to set Leech Seed. New types like Sound are able to encompass Pokemon like Chimecho and Exploud, which always felt a bit out of place in their own archetypes, very similar to how the Fairy type retroactively replaced many normal typings. Given how many moves revolve around making noise too, it's a fairly natural inclusion. The Naljo Guardians are completely original. It's hard to judge new designs. Sometimes, even when they're in the mainline games, new designs take quite a while before they register in my brain as real and normal. That was certainly the case here, but they also fit really well into the region's theme. Raiwato uses magnetism to float and watch over the Naljo region, and its solid shell resembles lightning-struck sand. The way that its inner bits stretch below it like wires also plays into the idea that it is grounded, which is pretty ironic. That's probably where its rock-electric typing comes from. Libabeel is a tad more on the edgy side, with a Pokedex which states that its blood is a deadly poison for beings not native to the Naljo region, which is where the steel poison typing comes from. It reminds me of Solgaleo in its somewhat metallic outer body, like it's wearing some kind of armor. Flambaco, the ghost fighting type, beat Annihilate to the punch. This Jiu-Jitsu monkey is a martial arts master who attempts to keep the peace within Naljo, while the rest safeguard it from outside threats. Martial arts are typically associated with finding a sense of balance and peace within oneself, so this makes a ton of sense as a more native guardian. Varanius is the water-fire dragon who heads this archetype. It's extremely protective of the region and will do anything in its power to prevent outsiders from entering. I'm quite fond of its more traditionally dragon-like head paired to a snake-like body, and the blue fire that emanates from its back. It's a really striking color scheme. They slot right in as legendary creatures. By far the best inclusion, though, is that your dad, a figure shrouded in mystery for most of the adventure, but who everyone can't stop talking about, who is said to be a character completely wrapped up in his fame and thus a deadbeat dad leaving you and your mother out to fend for yourselves. is motherfucking Lance. They made Lance your deadbeat dad. As someone who just wrapped up a huge retrospective series on 8 generations of Pokemon, ragging on Lance any chance I could, let me just say, my agenda is justified. This might not be real, might not be canon, whatever. I will forever think of Lance as an absent father. Fuck Lance. Genuinely, as much as I enjoyed this info dump during the mid-game about the region's mythos, throwing in the Lance plot twist threw me for a loop in a way that a game has not managed in a very long time. I actually laughed when the dude called him a loser. It was so gratifying. And now you, the 10-year-old, get to go out and save the region that this fucker can't be bothered to protect. I cannot express how much this rules. It's pretty surreal playing in the Gen 2 engine with a level curve that feels well considered, and a bunch of trainers who have sensible mons and move pools. It does mean that this is demanding quite a bit more than the mainline games usually do. I kinda threw together my team on a whim. Wanted to run with Tyranitar since it's your starter. Never been able to use all 3 Johto starters before, so I slapped those onto my team when I got them, leaving me with 3 single-type mons. Add Glaceon and Luxray to that list, and I'm lacking a lot of stab coverage, which Prism is keen to capitalize on. I made it a priority to stock up on healing items whenever I could, as longer stretches would drain my resources a ton. Turns out, making competent trainers means that a lot of your Pokemon are going to die. Now, this isn't a Draiano level hack, your rival uses a Parasect. It's just that they have pretty competent movesets and will exploit any vulnerabilities in your team whenever they can. I mean, you look at first gym leaders of the mainline games and you'll get trainers like Roxanne who have 1 or 2 stab moves and a few unremarkable setup moves. Faulkner only has Gust on Pidgeotto. Heart Gold and Soul Silver add Roost in there, how cute. The first gym of Prism against Josiah is a Fire-type gym. It seemed like a way to ease you into the game, as your Larvitar will give you a handy type advantage. Then you look and see that his Charmander has Sunny Day and Metal Claw, which is fairly aggressive for a first gym. Sunny Day blocks out water types while boosting their Embers, and Slugma even has Rock Throw and Smog to round out their movesets. Not a move here is wasted, and that extends to every single gym or rival fight that follows. They're incredibly well tuned. Brooklyn uses fairy types like Wigglytuff and Meryl, who can put you to sleep, double slap you, a move that is now fairy type, Iron Tail you, and even Defense Curl Rollout, which is always fun. Edison has a Sneasel it actually gets to make use of as a glass cannon, since this hack utilizes the physical special split. Sneasel was almost always a scary mon to run into, and pairing it with a tanky Umbreon that knows Confuse Ray and Substitute gives the team a lot of interesting approaches. The new gas typing being attached to different mons like Weezing and Torkoal means that Ayaka's team is pretty diverse. A nuisance of a Haunter that inflicts status conditions, a beefy Torkoal that can fire off powerful flamethrowers and lower accuracy, and even a Drapion with Earthquake, Sludge Bomb, and Night Slash. It's a meticulously considered curve of difficulty which is very comfy compared to Gen 2's usual vacuum of trainers to fight for sufficient experience. Like those games, you get to explore Region after the Elite Four and challenge all the gyms. On top of that, there are mini-games everywhere, like a board game where you can catch powerful Pokemon, a game corner with poker and blackjack that I spent an unhealthy amount of time grinding away at. That game corner has a matching game where you can get useful items like rare candies, which was a very nice way to spend my points on things other than Pokemon. My favorite new addition, though, was the Orphanage. In every game, completing the Pokédex is a tall order. So many Pokemon to find, and a lot of box space used up by mons you'll never even see or think about again. The Orphanage gives you the opportunity to donate these mons, rather than force them to waste away in your PC. I was shocked by how seamlessly this slotted into the collection aspect of Pokemon. For every mon you donate, you get points added to your card that you can use to adopt rare mons of your own. It's a fascinating counter to the idea of stockpiling Pokemon and throwing them away, and though it's a relatively minor new addition, it's definitely the one that impacted me the most. It directly conflicts with one of Pokemon's core features, which is centered around never letting go of these lovable creatures, and raises questions about that desire as it compounds with hundreds of new Pokemon every generation. Is that tenable? Are we doing these pixels a disservice, chucking them into virtual spaces never to be used or loved like your main team? It's also a feature that contrasts with one of the story's main themes, exploring the abusive aspects of the Pokemon and trainer relationship. The mainline games were pretty unwilling to touch this idea for pretty obvious reasons. Hugh's sister's Liepard is probably the only time it has ever come up, and even then they have to dance around the subject. Prism, being disconnected from the official production process, is able to dive into this full force. The same scientists that brought Mewtwo into being are responsible for capturing and torturing a bunch of innocent Pokemon, trying to purge them of their genetic weaknesses through cloning. Your rival is obsessed with that kind of biological strength. One of the first things he does is physically harm the Bagon he steals, and it's a nice touch that it spams rage in your first battle against it. It's not a stretch to assume he does this with all of his partners. Thinking more about it, this is probably what the struggle of the region is really about. These non-native Naljo residents storming into the region, adding a bunch of advanced tech which warps reality, disrupts ecosystems, does noticeable harm to the Pokemon living otherwise peacefully, changing lives forever. It asks how necessary that stuff really is. Why was there a prison built on top of the birthplace of the Naljo Guardians? Why do these security guards lock up 10-year-olds with fake IDs and get drunk on the roof, disrespecting the ground they walk on? This kind of tone most reminds me of the Ore region featured in Colosseum and XD. You might notice, those games also weren't made by Game Freak. They had a different style and approach. They were a bit edgier, a bit different. We probably owe that feeling to the fact that they were, official or otherwise, their own kind of derivative work. A fan work, one might even say. Fan work has always been important to me. I wrote some fan fiction when I was a lot younger. It was some of the first fiction writing I ever did, and while they will never see the light of day, I am really glad I wrote those. They're a window into what someone's perspective is on something they love, one that's more raw and vulnerable than an opinion piece could ever illustrate. When I was in high school, I was obsessed with a Kingdom Hearts 3 fanfiction called Brotherhood of Dark. It was a pretty lengthy series, and even though the author never finished it, so much of it remains in my head. It had awesome Keyblade transformations before KH3 was even a whisper on anyone's lips. A bunch of characters from the Disney World and Hollow Bastion are part of this crew of all the major characters who jump into a big airship and tour around to help the worlds again. It's a little indulgent in retrospect. Almost every main character got a romantic pairing. A lot of time is devoted to cute scenes of them together. Riku and Yuffie were paired together, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, but it was likely a pairing the author was a fan of. Roxas and Naminé got to live on inside Sora and Kairi while their romance blossomed, and so Roxas and Naminé got together as well. Felt like a pretty natural extension of the end of 2 in that way. There are also a bunch of OCs who have their own romantic pairings. It's all a bit odd and kinda amateurish. There are spelling and grammar mistakes everywhere. It seems like part of it exists to explain weird things the author figured should have happened. The first chapter has Sora going to lock the Destiny Island's keyhole because, they never actually did that, did they? It's as if the story seeks to remedy that hole. When I read connections like the scientists in Prism actually being behind the Mewtwo experiments in Red and Blue, or the missing No that haunt Botan City in Brown, they are blazing hot hallmarks of a superfan who wanted to make a cool connection. I find that pretty endearing. Yeah, maybe it's a little cringe, a little strange, but isn't that the most pure expression of oneself and their interests? Fan work is maybe one of the most direct ways into someone's heart. It doesn't have to send itself through any of the traditional economic avenues. Publishers don't have to okay it, they legally cannot be made for profit, and they're usually worked on by a single person with a pure vision. That's why this weird, obscure KH3 fanfic will stick in my mind forever. Even if I prefer the KH3 we eventually got, that doesn't diminish this version of KH3 that this creator wanted, this alternate reality we can jump into for a while and figure out what this person saw in the games. It's also likely why I've never personally felt bothered by big franchises pivoting in different directions, at least not recently, because that's already an experience I go through when I dive into fan works of my favorite games. I mean, look, I like Sonic games. This kind of framework is basically inevitable for me. There's more Sonic fan work than there is officially released works by a pretty wide margin. Sometimes they float in this dubious gray area like Sonic Mania, which I consider a fan work in my brain, even though it's obviously an official game. That's likely due to my consideration of works like AM2R, Sonic Triple Trouble 16-bit, and Pokémon Prism to be just as cool as the official games. It's difficult to find a dividing line between them that isn't purely legal. I refer to Prism not as a fan game, but a Pokémon game. It's a shame, then, that this work has to be corralled off into a legally dubious corner and dragged into the Shadow Realm when it gets too much attention. One of the reasons Pokémon Prism is still unreleased is because it got too popular in 2016. Nintendo sent a cease and desist, shutting the project down before it could see its release. The only reason for that is because Nintendo and the Pokémon Company own the rights to this idea. But how do you own the right to an idea that fuels a work of art? How can you tell someone that the drawing of a Pikachu they made isn't uniquely theirs? That it didn't spring from their personal perspective on what a Pikachu even is? That their hard work didn't bring this idea from their brains into existence? A not uncommon response to many fan works is the idea that if these devs are so talented, they should just go work on original games. Indeed, this was the opinion of Game Informer back in 2016 when Prism was shut down. It was their opinion that Nintendo were fully within their rights and that Cool Boy Man should just go work on original stuff instead. Ignoring the idea that many professional artists use fan work to build out their skill set, I also feel like this mindset completely invalidates any value from highly derivative works. Let me ask you this. What is the fundamental difference between Pokémon Sword and Shield and Pokémon Prism? Does Sword and Shield have the same developers that created Red and Blue? Well, not really. Game Freak ship a Theseus to themselves over the years. There are different devs running that show. You could reasonably assume the people who make the official games were once fans themselves. It would be insane to ask them to simply go make original works instead of working on Pokémon. In that way, it's no different from Prism, a Pokémon game that sprung from the minds of people who were not part of Red and Blue. It's a window into their view of Pokémon, what they want the franchise to be. The answer to that quandary is unique to every person. Such is the beauty of art. But so too why many fan works, including official fan works, are so divisive. All of it, in some way, is a deviation from that original vision which birthed it all. An existential question every franchise must face. One group of devs are part of Game Freak and can legally contribute their vision for the franchise, and everyone else is not allowed to do so. Only allowing one brand-approved answer to that question is unfortunate. I hate copyright. I have always hated it. I understand it. I know why it exists. It makes sense to me. And I hate it. Just as I hate that the official games need to prioritize profit and quick turnarounds. At the end of the day, whether I like what the work turns out to be or not, I'm always going to be on the side of the artists who created it, and I think I owe a lot of that aggressive empathy to my background reading and writing fan fiction and playing fan games. I had to watch a lot of these games blink out of existence. I watched years of blood, sweat, and tears flush down the drain. I suppose that's why I'm glad Nintendo and most other gaming companies cannot stamp out the totality of fan work. For every fan work that's quashed, like Prism or Uranium or whatever else, there are a whole host of others that fly under the radar. That flickering ember of creativity will never truly go out. I think that's wonderful. It's true that Pokémon Prism was never released. But those ideas won't disappear into that good night. It found its way onto the internet. It exists out there. I'm glad it does. And I wanted to shine a bit of light onto one of history's greatest losers in our medium. Pokémon Prism was clearly a labor of love, a work that matches and even surpasses many of the mainline games, and it deserves to be recognized for that. Not as a tool to bludgeon Game Freak, but as a work that can stand alongside many of their creations. It may not have won in the same way that Sword and Shield were roaring successes financially, but I also might just prefer this version of what Pokémon can be. I wonder then, which game really lost? Pokémon games are everywhere. From the sleek Emerald Sea Glass, which seeks to visually transform the third generation into an approximation of the second, to difficulty hacks like Renegade Platinum, which aim to amp up the teams you fight quite significantly. There's a whole world of games out there, but one of my favorites, and an idea I can't believe hasn't been created officially yet, is Poké-Rogue, a Pokémon roguelike. If you want to hear me talk about this, and maybe a bit about Slay the Spire and Balatro, you should head on over to Nebula. I couldn't quite place it in this video, it was too much of a tangent. But Nebula allows for me to expand on niche asides like this and develop them into their own videos in a way that just wouldn't make as much sense here on the channel. Here's a snippet. Pokémon who benefit from the stat boosts of berries, or those who have abilities related to their use, have a lot of value. I carried a Belly Drum Lanoon pretty damn far after loading it up with a bunch of berries that procced at low health, and also happened to heal Lanoon back to full. That was a really fun synergy. If you like what you hear, I have several other exclusive videos talking about ideas like TCG Pocket and gambling, Astrobot and PlayStation's legacy, my concept for Sonic Generations, and the tragic irony of Hi-Fi Rush. I plan to make many more. Other creators, like Eurothug, are also part of Nebula. She made an incredible video about the PS3 demo scene as part of the Nebula Plus category of content. These were a series of titles which shared a lot in common with the commercial aims of demos, but were created more for the purposes of entertainment and to stand on their own, rather than to sell the system. Maria does an excellent job diving into the demo scene, walking one through what they're like to play and the emotions they elicit. If you're a fan of her amazing YouTube content, it's created with the same love and attention, simply exclusive to Nebula. You can watch this and those other videos I mentioned exclusively over on Nebula. No matter where you look, Nebula has fun stuff to watch. Their originals are awesome. Epos Vox has a series called Print Screen, which is a retrospective type show which discusses forms of analog video like home cameras, webcams, and the Game Boy camera. His episode on the Game Boy camera especially was a fascinating deep dive into the little tool, and I learned so many things about it. I never realized how little I knew other than a bunch of random features in Zelda and Pokemon games that I could never interact with. I highly recommend sitting down and watching this wild ride and many others. I can vouch for their quality and originality. That's why I'm proud to be part of Nebula, a streaming service delivering exciting new artistic works. If you're looking to check out what the site has to offer, you can use my link below to check out my channel, which will have every video I release on YouTube, as well as my exclusive videos like my aforementioned video on Poké-Rogue. Using my link, you'll get 40% off a yearly plan, which shakes out to $36 a year or $3 a month. You can also choose a monthly plan at $6 a month, or go for a lifetime plan for $300. That's right, you'll get access to Nebula for life. All of this using my link below. New paid subscribers also receive guest passes to give out to others, so if you end up loving it, you can invite friends and family to check it out free of charge. No credit card information required. And for those of you that want to share everything Nebula has to offer with your family and friends, Nebula is now offering annual gift cards. Use the link gift.nebula.tv/KingK to give a year of Nebula to a friend for just $36. I think you'll all really enjoy what Nebula has to offer if you give it an honest chance. It's a bright beacon of creative hope in an increasingly dark and stormy, independent creator landscape. So go check it out now at nebula.tv/KingK, and I'll see you there.